when we sometimes comment on these kind of things, which is that sometimes a thing that we find troubling about love as it exists today has just always been the case. So like if you look at the history of romance literature or kind of philosophical writings on love, love's kind of always been embarrassing. There's never been a point where, the dominant intellectual strain about love was that like actually love's like really chill and has no kind of involvement of passion or and as a result no kind of vulnerability and subsequent embarrassment. I mean, I think that anyone that's been in love can kind of tell that, yeah, like of course love is embarrassing. You talked about Plato's Symposium. The character of Alcibiades in Plato's Symposium remarks that Socrates is the only man who can make him feel ashamed. And yeah, this is partly because Socrates is kind of trying to ethically improve Alcibiades, and he does just kind of fail in that. I mean, anyone who knows what Alcibiades got up to after when this dialogue is set will know that Socrates is ultimately unsuccessful in making Alcibiades like a nice guy or an ethical person by his standards. But I think also the comment about Socrates being the only man that can make Alcibiades feel ashamed reflects the fact that being in love is very vulnerable. And as a result, there kind of is a certain amount of shame, right? I mean, partly because culturally, both today and at various points throughout history, like we view kind of emotional independence to be quite a good thing. And I think that in many ways, love just kind of cuts against that. You know, you're a child and people tell you that part of growing up is, things don't bother you in the same way that they used to. When you're 7 and something would go wrong and you kind of scream your head off because you're 7, you just kind of don't really know how to deal with things yet. And you grow up and you come up with various ways of coping, and then you fall in love and all of a sudden you're 7 again. And everything feels like the stakes are very, very heightened. And that just kind of is an embarrassing situation to be in. So that's one thing I kind of want to say right off the bat is that, love, I think, has always been like a little bit fraught. And so that's not to deny, however, that there are peculiar problems with love as it exists today that are worth talking about and are worth tackling. I just think that like sometimes we talk about, problems with modern love, and like we immediately, there's almost an implication sometimes read into that, love was fine in the 17th century. So, well, probably not. Like, probably they not only had the kind of perennial problems in love, but they had their own problems in the way that love exhibited itself. So I think that it's important not to imagine that there was this kind of golden age of love. But yeah, there are plenty of problems with love. I like the phrase from Plato to Pornhub. I mean, that's quite a striking contrast.
Well, if we go into that further, what do you think is the biggest perennial problem with love that has never changed?
It's a tricky question. I think the embarrassment is probably part of it. Like, love is just inherently vulnerable. I think it's vulnerable at all levels, right? This isn't even limited to romantic love, right? It's very vulnerable to love your family, right? Because you're effectively caring about something that can be taken away from you. There's a bit in Marcus Aurelius's Meditations where he's kind of writing about his own children. Marcus Aurelius lost a huge number of his children, and he's saying, these. Your child isn't really yours, it is external to you, and ultimately, like, you can't control whether it is taken from you or whether it remains with you. And in many ways, that's the same kind of vulnerability, just in a slightly different way. I think that romantic love, however, I just think is incredibly interesting, partly because I think that there's a particular kind of idealization that happens in romantic love that I think is its own very, very interesting phenomenon. This is it's kind of come into more prominence recently, this kind of idea of limerence. It was introduced by Dorothy Tenov, but a lot of her work is based on the observations of the French novelist Stendhal, who is fantastic and just generally like absolutely amazing. He wrote this little kind of it's like bigger than a pamphlet, but it's smaller than a tome. It's like a kind of 250 odd page book. It's quite kind of scattered observations concerning love and also concerning like various observations of the countries he's visited and stuff. It's kind of a big jumble. But in that, he develops a theory of what we might loosely term idealization in love. And he calls it crystallization because it has this image of, okay, you've got a stick and you drop it in the Salzburg salt mines. and you come back to it 2 weeks later and it's covered in crystals and you can barely see the stick for what it is because it's so covered in these adornments. And that's kind of how he thinks love works generally. And this is then ties into, Dorothy Turnoff kind of takes these observations and runs with it, creating her kind of much more developed theory of limerence. But for Stendhal, this is just like a feature of romantic love. And I think it ought to be noted that we think about limerence today as like a kind of pathology almost. Like we kind of think, you've got like proper love on the one hand and you've got limerence on the other hand. Limerence is this kind of embarrassing, erotic, scary cousin of love. I don't think that's really how Turnoff saw it. I think that towards the end of her book, she spends a lot of time kind of rehabilitating limerence and talking about, in many ways, this is an emotion that we shouldn't exile to the outer darkness. This is a valuable part of the human experience to not necessarily learn to control. That's the kind of the wrong word for it, but to examine in detail and kind of get a handle on in a kind of loose sense. But to bring this back to Stendhal, I think that something that he identifies with love, which I think people just generally find frustrating, I think for very good reason, but I will defend this in many ways, is his notion of crystallization, which is kind of where I think this is probably most evident when somebody first develops a crush on someone. I think that's probably like the most everyday example of what crystallization is. I don't know if anyone's ever had a crush on like a coworker or like when you're at school or university, and crushes are perfectly normal. I'm sure that many people watching have had them. I've certainly had them. You end up in this state where you might find somebody initially fascinating and attractive or what have you, and then you kind of like take that away. And then you kind of supplement it with your imagination in a whole host of ways. And that might not necessarily involve lying. It might just involve just kind of placing more emphasis on the positive traits and downplaying the negative traits. There's this wonderful point in Turnoff's book. Turnoff's book, Love and Limerence, is fantastic. And partly because it includes so many interviews. So she has loads of interviews with people who felt limerent, which is like a huge number of people. This is not some kind of like tiny minority of people. I can't remember the exact like estimate she gives, but it's like a lot of people. It's not like a kind of aberrant emotion. And one of the things one of the interviews says is that I could kind of tell that they had these negative qualities, but it just didn't quite stick. Like it kind of just didn't seem salient in quite the same way as their positive qualities.
It almost feels like that emphasis on the positive versus negative, it leads you over time, slowly but surely, to form essentially a delusion about your partner or your crush. How much of love do you think is delusion?
I think that maybe delusion is like a kind of loaded term. So I'm going to say illusion. Just it feels slightly less condemnatory. And in many ways, I think that the illusions that we feel in love, it is not at all obvious to me that these are necessarily bad things all the time. I think one of the difficult aspects of crystallization and of the kind of illusory components to love is that sometimes they're a great thing and sometimes they're really not a great thing. This is what I mean when I say this is kind of a classic example of a kind of a perennial issue with love. I think that would kind of exist anywhere where humans are. That's a big claim, but I think that's probably true. Because on the one hand, there's a really strong argument that you don't want to see things too clearly, okay, so sometimes this is called like the rationalist picture of love. And there are good arguments to suggest that a rationalist picture of love, where you objectively see the properties of the person, of your beloved, let's say, and you love them in virtue of those clearly seen properties, is probably not true. Because of all of the observations of people like Stendhal and Turnoff, but also like in an important sense, it's really like undesirable. So I was trying to think of a good way to illustrate this. Like, there's a book called there's a book by Troy Jollymore, who's a philosopher of love, and I can't remember the name of it. I think it's called Love's Vision, or The Vision of Love. I've got the ebook, and I never quite remember the titles of the ebooks, because when you like reading it, you don't see the title very much. But anyway, that's kind of by the by. But he cites another thinker who I can't remember the name of, who talks about how like weirdly perverse it would be if, say, someone had a child and they were like, well, you know, I love my child in virtue of their properties. You know, if I love them because they're, you know, they're intelligent, they seem bright, they've got a promising future, and if they were to cease to have those properties, of course, only naturally I would cease to love them. You know, we think there's something quite perverse about that. And they're also, you know, that's a non-romantic version. There are many reasons to think that this is also like not a great image for romantic love as well, as in not a desirable image for romantic love. And this might be kind of a vote in favor of a certain level of illusion in love. One example would be that it's known as kind of the trading up objection. So if your love is like totally rationally based, you know, you only love somebody in terms of the properties that, you know, you were that would remain there with a cold, objective view. And that is the things that is given rise to and is sustaining your love. Well, I mean, one objection to the desirability of such a view is that it would imply that should you ever come across someone with those same properties in greater amounts, you should immediately jump ship. Now,
someone with 98% level attractiveness instead of 97.
Yes, yeah, it'd be kind of like it's like a partner maxing approach. You know,
it's like FIFA cards.
Yeah, exactly, right. And you know, some people do this. I don't think it's like overwhelmingly common, but some people do this. But importantly, no matter how common it is, we all tend to view that as like not great. We tend to think that is not the desirable way for love to go.
Why?
I suspect because part of what we desire of love is a certain level of stability, right? Like, if what most people, you know, still most people desire a long-term monogamous partnership, be that manifesting in marriage or not, and that relies on there being a certain level of stability in love, and this kind of trading up view of love would kind of disrupt that stability. So that's one reason why it wouldn't necessarily be a desirable picture of love. Luckily, if we're to take into account these kind of illusory or semi-illusory aspects of love, like crystallization, where we kind of have a tendency to kind of